person, Abram. One big person that covers a nation. It's an Abraham nation. Well, understand that when I spoke earlier about Adam, and I made reference to Genesis 2:17, the commandment upon him that you can't eat forbidden fruit and expect to live, because if you eat this forbidden fruit, you're going to die. That sentence of death passed not only on to Adam, but that sentence of death passed on to everyone that was part of Adam's representative personality. And who is it that's represented by Adam even as early as Genesis 1:26? Again, who's represented by Adam as early as Genesis 1:26? Everybody is. Because at the very creation, Genesis 1:26 makes reference in the Hebrew to Adam. Adam is a reference to humanity. In other words, Genesis 1:26, then God said, let us make Adam. Often translated man, but definitely in the sense of mankind or humanity. Let us make man, as in Adam, the Hebrew word Adam. Let us make him in our image, in our likeness, and let them referring to the group, all of humanity, let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. Let them rule over the earth. Let them rule over creeping things. Let them rule. Why? Because when God created Adam, he created him as a representative of every person that would ever be a descendant of Adam. So every time Adam had a child, that was another member of Adam's group identity that was born. This is very clearly illustrated in Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, borrowing from the King James Version. Genesis 5, 1 and 2, very clearly indicated in the King James Version, where it begins in Genesis 5:1 by saying, these are the generations of Adam. I'll say it again. King James, Genesis 5:1, these are the generations of Adam. In other words, it mentions Adam as an individual who lives only 930 years, but he has a son, and that son continues the generation of Adam extended in the life of that son. And when that son dies as an individual, the group identity of Adam continues to live because he has another son that extends Adam's lifetime throughout this next generation in the life of that son. And then he dies in Genesis 5 because it's a genealogy. It lists the number of years these individuals have lived. But then it says that they had a son who lived a number of years. And the beginning of the chapter says, Genesis 5:1, these are the generations of Adam. So every time that a son of Adam lived, Adam continued to live in that son. In that further generation, every time he had a son, another generation of Adam had begun. And it's that way all the way through Genesis 5. Because Adam is clearly a group identity. And he lives throughout time as long as he keeps having descendants that come on the human scene. So when God pronounced the death sentence on Adam, he was announcing the death sentence on the whole of the human race. Why? Because Adam represents everybody that's a human being. Adam represents mankind, womankind, every boy, every girl. So when Adam sinned, guess what happened in the eyes of God to the human race later to be born? They were already given credit for a sin in Adam that represented them before they were even born, because Adam acted as the whole group when he committed his first sin. Now, what does this mean if we relate this now to Romans chapter 5, verse 12? What does this mean if we now relate this to Romans chapter 5, verse 12? Well, we see what it says. Therefore, through one man, namely Adam, in Greek it says the sin. So we're talking about the original sin, okay? Romans 5:12. Therefore, through one man, the sin entered the world. And through the sin, the death. In Greek it's the death, meaning the death penalty. The original death penalty, right? The death came into the world through the sin. And so the death passed on to all people because all people sinned. And when I'm interpreting Romans 5:12, I'm saying that all people sinned in the Garden of Eden because all people were represented in that person, that they all came from Adam. So he as a group identity acted in a negative way on behalf of all the people that would ever be born from his biological seed. So that means in Romans 5:12, therefore, through one man, the sin entered the world, and through the sin, the death penalty entered the world, and the death penalty passed on to all people because all people had sinned. In this context, all people sinned in identification with Adam. When he sinned, they are given credit for sin, not something that they did on their own as individuals later in history. They're getting credit for the original sin because they were viewed in the Garden of Eden as acting in a guilty manner because Adam represented them in his action. But if we can go on just for a moment to Romans 5:13, then we're going to see something that will be interesting, and I'm creating some room up here to go up top, Romans 5:13, which says, before the law was given. Remember we spoke earlier about the fact that grace is emphasized in Genesis 12 to 50, and then we said later on we get the law introduced in Exodus 20. Remember that in Exodus 20 when the 10 Commandments are given from Mount Sinai and God audibly speaks these commandments, imposing on the people this obligation that they have to be obedient or else they're not going to get God's approval. Well, in Romans 5:13, it says, before the law was given, sin was in the world. In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, living in the time covered by the book of Genesis, chapter 12 to 50, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when they were living, as recorded in the book of Genesis, chapters 12 to 50, there was sin in the world. They were doing things, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were all doing things at times that were unethical. They were all doing things that later on the law of Moses would have condemned their behavior. But what does Romans 5:13 says? What does Romans 5:13 say? For before the law was given, sin was in the world. But it goes on to say in Romans 5:13, sin is not taken into account when there's no law. In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were getting away with doing things, and God wasn't even looking at what they were doing as a thing that he was going to call them account for because they weren't under a law system. They lived before the law. So God wasn't telling them, oh, I'm upset with your behavior. No, he didn't regard their behavior because he hadn't put them under a law that would mean a relationship with him would be based on them having to behave properly. So in Romans 5:13, I say it again. Before the law was given, sin was in the world. But sin is not taken into account when there's no law. So what I mean is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though sometimes they did unethical things, God didn't regard those things that they did and take account of them. In fact, when Abram slept with Hagar, the Egyptian slave girl, as recorded in Genesis 16, the next time that God appears to him 13 years later, in Genesis 17:1, the Lord appeared to him, which happened to be 13 years later, then God doesn't say anything about his sin with Hagar, doesn't say anything about his unbelief. Because that's what motivated him to sleep with Hagar, was his unbelief that God would fulfill the promise through his real wife, Sarah. But did God say a thing about that incident when he appeared to him in Genesis 17:1? He said nothing about it. He just reaffirmed his promise, saying, I'm going to confirm my covenant with you. He just continued to treat Abraham according to the principle of grace, that he was under a grace relationship with God, not under a law-based relationship with God. So God was going to bless him in spite of his disobedience, right? Okay, that's grace. And we had said in Romans 5:13 that those people that were living before the law sometimes were messing up things, but God wasn't taking into account any of those things that were being messed up, because sin isn't taken into an account unless they're under a law system. So we go now to Romans 5:14. Romans 5 verse 14. Nevertheless, the death reigned. Oh my goodness. It just hit me. Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, the death reigned. The death is pictured like a ruler, like a king who's sitting on a throne. Nevertheless, the death reigned